Good evening, and welcome to another episode of the Willard Preacher Podcast. I'm Matt, a former student at Penn State. I'm joined, as always, by Gary Cattell, Penn State's Willard Preacher. And we are also really happy to be joined by Scott and Sophia, who are parishioners at Holy Trinity in State College, who are friends of Gary's. They were kind enough to join us here tonight and to sort of tell us their story about their walk with the Lord and coming into Holy Orthodoxy and their experiences therein. So that's kind of framing it. We're sort of doing this as part of a series of videos that where folks get a chance to give their testimony. And so they're going to share that with us tonight. So thanks so much for joining us, Scott and Sophia. And we'll turn it over to you in that case.
Awesome. Sounds good. Well, we're happy to be here and share our story. I think we discussed off pod, as they say. I think I was going to jump in first, and then Sophia was going to give her testimony. I guess I was mentioning that I've been jotting notes to try to keep my story kind of in line. But I'd say there's three major parts I think that I'll probably talk about. Kind of my journey into Orthodoxy, some of my early life in Orthodoxy as somebody who had recently joined the church, and then I think kind of my journey to Sophia, which I kind of view as a very a walk that I took with the Lord, and I think that'll cue up her testimony very well. So with that, I'll I'll try to keep it PG rated at least. But it's a very interesting journey. I guess in my youth, I grew up outside of Boston as a congregational. So that for church history nerds was a church that grew out of the Puritans. So the Puritans came to New England and they split largely into two groups, the Congregationals and then the Unitarians. And so kind of that mainline New England Protestantism. In what it looked like, I would say it's very similar to Presbyterianism, not necessarily in church structure, but just in terms of the liturgics. What's unique about Congregationalism is that it kind of rejects all church structure, that the church is as big as the congregation itself. So whatever that congregation believes is what that church believes, is that there's not really beholden to other church structures. So I kind of grew up, believing in God and learning about Jesus. And not really having any church structure. And it was something that we did on Sundays.
So Scott, so that church that you're in, that doesn't have anything to do with any other congregational church,
Not officially.
as far as theology goes.
Not by definition. Yeah, that's a good question because many of those churches are part of the UCC, the United Church of Christ. So that's how they will find a minister if they need a minister. But by definition, each church could believe what the members wanted to believe. I think in my experience, going from church to church, there wasn't a lot of theological difference, but also when you drilled into it, there was not a lot of definitions, right? That was something that I struggled with early in life is, what is the Trinity? How do we understand the relationship between God the Father, God the Son? What is the Holy Spirit? And I would say that, if I asked 15 people, I would get 15 different answers. And so that's kind of theologically what I grew up with. And so that was something that we did every Sunday. And we did not really miss a Sunday. It was something that, I wouldn't say that we were super religious, but it was something that we were just, you do it on Sunday. That's what you do. I had cousins that grew up overseas as Baptist missionaries. And so I always looked to them as better than us because they took their faith and did something with it. But that's kind of what I grew up with. And when I went to college, this is a time in people's lives when they have more independence. They can kind of live their life the way that they want to live it. And while I saw a lot of folks my age kind of falling away from faith, I found myself going to the local Methodist church. I'd never kind of interacted with Methodism, but it seemed on the surface pretty cool. Enjoyed talking with the people there, got pretty involved. and did that throughout my undergrad until they said that, hey, the bishop's visiting. And I said, oh, you all have bishops? And then I never came back. So there was something about church structure that frightened me. I was just to my core a very hardcore Congregationalist, I guess. So after college, I lived on the frontier of the Canadian border in 3 different places. So I was up in northern Maine. I lived in the woods. I was a wildlife biologist, and I didn't have a lot of access to church, but I also didn't really seek out church. I kind of, would read the Bible from time to time, but I would experience God in nature and kind of this transcendentalist sort of mode of religion. And it was during that time after school that I was actually dating a Catholic girl briefly. And I remember that was kind of big for me because I thought Catholics were very strange. I had gotten hung up with, the concept of the Eucharist, and I just, there were a lot of issues that I had with Roman Catholicism. And so, it was just early stages. We had just been dating about a month or so. And I remember there was one day in the summertime, and I was driving down, early spring actually, and I was driving down the highway in the middle of nowhere and listening to, the radio preacher on the radio. And I remember he said, if you ask God to send the Holy Spirit into your life, he will, and he will do what you ask of him. And I thought, oh, okay, well, let's give that a try, So I'm driving and I close my eyes, going down the highway, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, what do you ask God, right? If you're in front of God, like, who am I to ask of him anything? So I figured, well, you got to say something nice, And so I said, Lord, help me to help people. And then I was like, all right, well, that's kind of generic, but and I keep driving, and I swear it was like a second after I said that, I pass a car broken down on the side of the road. So I keep driving, going down the road, and I'm like, oh, hey, wait, that was it. So I do a U-turn, go back, and I'm like, what's going on? And their radiator had broken, and I actually happened to have 2 extra jugs of radiator coolant in my car because I was going to do a coolant flush, and I never got around to it. So it was this kind of perfect storm of like, hey, I have what you need. And so I helped them out, and they were like, oh, can we pay you? And I said, no, it's all right. God sent me probably. And they were like, what? And I was like, don't worry about it. So helped him out, hopped back on the road, driving my truck. And I thought, well, dang, that was pretty fast. I guess that guy was serious when he said that. So I went back to God, and I said, what was on my heart was I was thinking about this girl that I was dating. And I was thinking, I remember I prayed specifically. I said, Lord, if this is love, let it grow. And if it's not, then, show me what love is. You got to be very careful when you ask God to show you what love is.
Yeah.
And so it was actually that weekend that I ran into a girl that I had dated briefly freshman year. And we kind of had just like fallen apart and just, went our own ways, no hard feelings. And we started chatting about, how her life was going, how my life was going. And I was just incredibly moved by the experiences that she had had. She had her sister had left the family, and she had had to drop out of college for financial reasons. She had had an abusive boyfriend, and there was just all this amazing, incredible emotional, weight that had been put upon her. And I found myself very moved with compassion for her. And I just was like, oh my goodness, like I really want to take care of this person. I was kind of like overwhelmed with this feeling of like, why do I care so much about this? And then I realized, oh, like I appear to be, very moved and in love with this person. And so I called up my current girlfriend. I said, I'm sorry, this is kind of a weird story, but I ran into somebody, and it turns out I still had feelings for them. And she said, okay, well, we've only been dating a month, so I guess I understand, but that's too bad, but best of luck. And so that summer I then started to date this girl, and we had a very kind of intense, very passionate relationship. And I would describe it as falling kind of head over heels for this person. And it was an interesting one because she was very kind of kept me at arm's length. She had suffered with a lot of things in her childhood, including abuse and whatnot. And so she was kind of psychologically somebody who it was hard for her to let people love her because she didn't love herself. And so that was something that I was very difficult, but at the same time, I had this inner peace because I knew, all I have to do is be here for this person, and all I wanted to do was to be there for that person. And at the end of the summer, she had an anxiety attack and basically said, hey, it's too much. I'm going to move back home with my parents and try to finish my degree at community college. And I said, it's fine. I'll drop everything. I'll move to Vermont. I'll get a job there. And she said, nope, just let me do this. So I drove her to Vermont, moved her stuff back into her parents' house, gave her a hug, and then drove away. And it was a pretty dark time for me. I was pretty sad. I had already made plans to leave my pretty good job that I had had. And I decided to continue with it because where I was working on the Canadian border, it was very beautiful. It was very scenic, but it was very remote. And I knew that if I had stayed there, I was going to get kind of stuck. And so I said, let's do a change of things. So I looked on Craigslist, and I had just learned how to run a chainsaw. So I typed in the word chainsaw, called the first job, and they said, oh, okay, we'll hire you. And so I ran a chainsaw for a logging company. I was a lumberjack, essentially. I lived in a cabin outside of Bangor. And it was in this time that I, simultaneously kind of sunk into a kind of a deep depression. And I also became very hedonistic in my life. Up to that point, I had tried to preserve, my honor and everything like that. And just in my sadness, I just kind of let loose, and I kind of became very hedonistic. I guess that would be how I describe that period. And I brewed my own ale, which is fine. That's a good hobby to have. But my buddies and I, we drank a lot. I became involved with a much older woman, and it was just a very interesting time of, it seemed like liberation at the time, but it was kind of going the way of the world. And thanks to God, only a month or two of that, I kind of realized that it wasn't fulfilling. I kind of saw into the future, and I said, well, sure, I could do this for years, but I'd be in the same place that I am now. And there was a documentary about rock climbing that I watched, and I said, hey, that seems cool. I'll go do that. So I quit my job. It's the only job I've ever quit. And I packed up all my stuff in a car, and I drove all the way to Southern California, and I lived in the desert for half a year. My buddy and I were living out of the back of his Honda Civic, and we were rock climbing. We were, hardly eating anything, eating dried beans that were given to us by, nice people in the town. And we rock climbed every day. But I made him drive me into town every Sunday and drop me off at church. And so I went to a little Presbyterian church called Little Church of the Desert. And it was a very interesting time because during that period of time and that isolation in the desert, you're kind of in this very austere environment. And I took it upon myself to read just about every religious text that I could. In my undergrad, I did a humanities program where we had studied, all the major world religions, and read books like the Bible and the Quran, and dove into the Hadith and Buddhist texts and all these other things. But in the desert, I read everything. I read books about Islam. I read books about Mormonism. I read books about Jainism. I really dove into everything to try to figure out truth. And it was interesting because I started going to that Presbyterian church, and the minister at the end of every sermon, his focal point was that man needed to get into right relationship with God. And I saw that as transcending many religions. And that was something that I really keyed in on. That was not an idea that was really expressed to me in my youth. We just kind of went to church, and the impetus was on whether or not you believed that God existed. It wasn't that you had to do anything or that there was some sort of thing that needed to be amended. And so I kind of thought about that. And I read the book of Acts. I really dove into the Bible again, as well as reading a daily devotional. And I started to have these moments where I had kind of narrowed it down to I felt that God existed because it was almost like I came to this moment of realization where there's a story about two fish that are swimming down a stream, and a third fish passes them, right? And he says, how's the water? And they're like, what are you talking about? Because it's all around. And I kind of came to this realization, kind of growing out of my study of philosophy, that was like, well, yes, everything is here, but like, why is it here? Right? Like it just did, like atheism just didn't make sense to me. And so conceding that there was a deity, I remember I prayed in the desert out under a million stars, and I said, like, Lord, like, I'll walk towards you if you walk towards me. Like I'll try to take that first step but you got to meet me halfway. You gotta help me along this process. And I remember when I was praying that very heartfelt prayer, my eyes were closed, but there was a flash of light. And I thought where we were camping that somebody had driven their car up. And I opened my eyes and it was just, the darkness of the desert. And it was just this interesting kind of like tidbit of that's interesting. And I actually, when I was in town one day after church, the same church building was used by this evangelical Spanish church that was composed primarily of Mexicans that had come up from Mexico itself, which was new to me being from New England. And I said, hey, can I go to your church? And they said, yeah, sure. And so it was a very exciting service. They handed out tambourines. It was pretty fun. And they invited me to watch the Super Bowl with them. And so I remember I was talking to one of them, and I mean, if anybody ever wanted to make a movie about Xerxes, it would be this man. I mean, he was like this 7 foot tall, kind of long ringlets of black hair, a very intense looking man. And I remember he looked at me from across this living room and he just walked for me and he just gave me his testimony. And it was this incredible story of a man who had gotten really involved in gang violence and had killed a lot of people. And he said one day he and his buddies had blood on their hands. I mean, they had just killed a man. And he looked at his buddy and he said, we're going to have to pay for this. And his friend said, no, man, like nobody saw us, the cameras, there were no cameras. And he said, no, like not people, like this is going to come back to us. We need to, this is not right. And his buddy was like, what are you talking about? So he said, I'm out. And he walked down the street and he didn't know how far he walked, kind of absentmindedly. And he stopped for some reason and looked up and there was a Catholic church. And he walked up the steps and he walked inside, blood on his hands. And the only person in that church was his grandmother. And she was kneeling at the front praying that her son would leave that life. And it was an incredible, answered prayer. And he threw it all away. He left the gang. He started a family. And he had many kids. But somebody from the gang days came back years later and said, hey, you got to start pushing drugs for us again. And he said, nope, I'm not going to do it. And then they showed up at his kid's school and kind of threatened his kid. And he said, okay, you don't threaten my kids. So he went and he killed that person. And they got arrested. And I remember he was in prison and his lawyer was like, you're going away. The judge has the highest conviction rate in the state of California. There's no way you're getting out of this. And he said, at that point, he prayed to God and he said, I gave my life to you. I messed up. Give me one more chance. And he feels that he spoke with God and God said, you have one more chance. And when he was in prison, he started evangelizing to the other prisoners. And there's these amazing stories of, there was one fellow that was kind of resistant and he said, I'm not going to believe you unless I see a picture of Jesus that's my son's age, like 14. I don't know why he said it, but the next day, this guy got in the mail, his family had sent him a little coloring page that his kid had drawn, and it was a picture of Christ when he was 14 years old. And he gave it to the guy and said, here's your photo. And the guy was like, where did you get this? And so there's amazing stories. And he started converting the whole jail. And everyone was like, what's going on? And so he went to his defense attorney and he said, God's going to set me free. It's going to be like, Peter and when he breaks, out of prison. And he said, that's not going to happen. You're going to prison for a long time. You killed a guy. They know you did it. He said, no, man, it's going to happen. God's going to set me free. And they get a letter from the judge eventually. And the judge says, meet me in my office. And the defense attorney is like, you're done, Shows up in the office and the judge said, I've been thinking about things and my conviction rate is very high. And looking at your story, I decided to revisit it. And, you did something wrong, but I've seen a lot of other good that you've done. And I'm going to give you one more chance. And we're going to let you go on probation, but we're going to let you go. And the defense attorney was like, I've never seen this happen in my life. And so, so he left and then he was an associate pastor of that church and he just gave his life even more to God. And I mean, it's just incredible, these stories that I was picking up along the way. So I got a phone call from a biologist that said, hey, do you want to be a loon biologist? Oh, I should say, see, this is why I need notes. I, at that moment, had decided to go to seminary. So this has happened 3 times in my life. When I was a kid, I looked up to the minister in our church and I thought, well, thinking about my cousins and how they'd given their life as missionaries, I thought, okay, if you truly believe this, Christ says, leave everything and follow me, why aren't we doing that? And so I had wanted to become a minister when I was a kid. but I had stopped because I was worried that it was out of vanity, that I wanted to wear a black robe and have people look up to me. So I said, no, I'm not ready for that. And then years later in undergrad, I had thought about it again. And there was a pastor of the local congregational church that I had started going to who also owned a pub. And he said most of his ministry was in that pub, the relationships that he had with people. And I thought, wow, that's really cool. This guy's really down to earth. Maybe I could be like him. Maybe I could go to seminary. I said, no, it's still out of vanity. I still don't think it's right, but I want to give my life to Christ, And then fast forward here in the desert, our time had kind of come to a close. Spring was coming, and I thought, man, maybe this is it. Maybe third time's a charm. Maybe I should give my life to Christ through the ministry. And I had been talking with the Presbyterian seminary down in the South about it's 1,001 churches program, and we were talking about me and coming there and enrolling in seminary and becoming a seminarian. And I was actually about to leave, and then I got a call from a New Hampshire biologist who said, hey, do you want to be a loon biologist, which is a large water bird up north? And I said, sure. And so I drove up to New Hampshire, and it was that summer that I thought to myself, okay, I'm working as a biologist, my chosen field, and maybe after this I'll go to seminary. But if I'm going to go to seminary, I should go to the right church. So I should examine all of the churches. And so I said, well, let's start with the easiest one to rule out. Let's start with Roman Catholicism, because that doesn't make any sense, right? And particularly the Eucharist. I said, I can rule out the Catholics because the true presence of Christ doesn't make any sense. And so I started researching, true presence of Christ on YouTube, and the YouTube rabbit holes it led me down took me down the path of Eucharistic miracles. And there was a whole Bible series looking at sacrifice in the Old Testament and how the Eucharist actually makes a lot of sense when you understand Old Testament sacrifice. And then they really drill down into the 6th chapter of John, where he says, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life in you. And then it says that everyone grumbled. And in one of the only times he's ever clarified himself in the Bible, he says, amen, amen, unless you eat my flesh. But he changes the word, and it's missed in English, which is unfortunate. In the original Greek, he initially says phagos, which is to consume like you would eat bread. But the second time he says eat, he says trogon, which is a term that is only used in the Bible when it's talking about wolves ripping flesh with their teeth. So he is asked to clarify himself. He uses an even more visceral term. And then it says everyone left. So obviously this is a controversial teaching. And so everyone leaves. He doesn't stop them. He turns to the disciples and he says, what do you think about this? And their response is, this is a hard teaching, but you are the Christ. And so I thought, wow, that sums it up. I don't understand the true presence in the Eucharist, but I understand that it's true. And I understand that Christ is the one with the words of eternal life and truth. And so we should just follow that. And so all of a sudden I was filled with this realization that I needed the Eucharist. And so I sprinted downstairs, got in my car, and I booked it to the nearest Catholic church, which was about 2 feet away from the Canadian border up in northern New Hampshire. And I, standing room only, a lot of French Canadians that had come over the border. And they're all having a mass in the evening. And, I stand in the back the whole time. And then they all leave. And I go up to the priest and I say, Father, I just learned about the Eucharist and I need this stuff. And he said, oh, really? And I said, now I understand as a Protestant, I can't consume it, right? And he said, he's an old Irish Catholic priest, and he said, if you don't know what it is, don't put it in your mouth. And I said, okay. And so he gave me a lot of reading materials, directed me to the Catechism of the Catholic Church. And the next few months, I took another job, radio tracking rough grass, spruce grass, actually, in northern Maine. And I worked through some of the RCIA, the adult conversion materials, and for the Catholic Church. But there were some major things that I had issues with theologically. I couldn't wrap my head around the infallibility of the Pope. The doctrine of the Immaculate Conception was kind of rubbed me the wrong way, and a few other things that rubbed me the wrong way. And it was around this time that my very close childhood friend, had been talking with this girl about philosophy and all these sorts of things, and she had said that she was Orthodox. And I said, oh, that's like a thing that Greek people do, right? And he said, well, no, she said, it's not Greek Orthodox, it's just Orthodox. And I said, huh. And so turned out that she went to the Antiochian Orthodox Church outside of Boston. And I started looking up Orthodoxy. And lo and behold, I found a church that was very similar to the Eucharistic church that I had found in Catholicism. And yet those issues I had with Catholicism were not present with Orthodoxy. And so I said, well, this is very different, very strange, but I want to investigate this because this seems like a good option. And so went to look up the nearest Orthodox church. And it turns out that the nearest Orthodox church to me was right down the road in Berlin, New Hampshire. And it's the last wooden Orthodox church that Tsar Nicholas II commissioned. And so I went there, and it's on this amazing hill above the city. And I went inside, and the service was at the same time the most foreign, but the most correct thing to me. I don't know how to describe it, but it was like anything in Orthodoxy. The more I drilled down, it was like 180 degrees different than what I had thought previously, and yet it made more sense. And so from that point on, I moved down to Bangor. I started going to a very small mission, OCA mission church that was there. And we began working through some catechesis. And I remember I walked into this little tiny back room where they were having the service because they didn't have a church yet. They were having it in the back room of this Anglican office building. And there was this one man that came up to me, and I was kind of bewildered looking. And he said, you're not going to understand a lot of things, but eventually everything has a reason in Orthodoxy. He said, you may not understand it at first, but everything has a reason, And at that point, they thrust a choir book in my hand because there were about 8 people there. And they said, you're in the choir. And I said, oh, no, I've really only been to one Orthodox church service. And they said, no, you're in the choir. And I said, okay. So it was an amazing time. It was a beautiful time. And I spent that winter living with my mom and was between jobs. So I just spent all my time reading, learning about Orthodoxy, going to all of the services at Holy Trinity Orthodox Cathedral in Boston. And I was received into the Orthodox Church through chrismation on Lazarus Saturday. And it was an incredible time. And I wanted to stay engaged with that community. And so I applied to a bazillion jobs, being in wildlife biology, having difficulty finding a job. And the only job that I heard back from, and the highest paying job, was the only job that would have allowed me to keep going to that church. All the other ones were out Colorado, all over the country. But this job was 2 hours down the road. And so I spent that summer coming back for services and staying engaged, and really growing in my faith. And the reason I kind of go into my early life in Orthodoxy is because it was an amazing time. And I've heard this from a lot of people is, there were many kind of miraculous events. And I know that, as my wise friend once said to me, miracles are for the person that they were intended for. They shouldn't necessarily be, proof or, reason for anyone to believe something. But for me, it was an amazing time to be able to be Orthodox and to be able to experience these things. These amazing things happened to me, and I was able to actually come to the Myrrh streaming icon, the Averon icon from Hawaii. And
Could you cut out for a second there? Could you say that again?
Yeah. So I was able to go to the Averon icon from Hawaii. So that was visiting, and I said, well, I heard about this when I was learning about Orthodoxy, but I guess I'll see it in person, and I'm being a scientist. I was a little bit skeptical. I was like, maybe there's a little pump in there that they're squeezing out myrrh. I don't really know how this works, but I decided, hey, I'm going to go, and make a pilgrimage. And so I drove up, and it was that fall, and I remember it was packed. I mean, I showed up a half hour early, and I was squeezed standing in the back. This long service, it was hot. It was the height of cold and flu season, so everyone was coughing and sneezing on me. I'm kind of a germaphobe, and I was just not. I was like, I don't know about this. So I wasn't really loving people as I should. And I remember they were slowly letting people go up and venerated afterwards. And we were some of the last in line, and I was kind of, people have been sneezing on me. I'm going to get a cold. And so I walked up and I went to go venerate it. And so I crossed myself and I leaned down, and it was the most incredible thing because sure, this icon, it looks like the way that it looks, and it has this glass case and it's covered in myrrh. And I said, okay, it's got a lot of myrrh on it. And I leaned down, and when I leaned down, it was almost as if my head passed through this orb. And all of a sudden, there was no icon, there was no frame, there was no church. I was looking at the Theotokos, and she was seated on a cloud in the heavens. And what was the most profound feeling for me, was not that I was seeing this, but that I felt her looking at me. It wasn't that I was looking at an image. It was that I was looking at a person and I could feel her looking back at me. And I just was frozen. And I was like, is this what everybody feels when they is it? And so I venerated it. And I just remember like floating out of that room and just being like, what was that? And for weeks afterwards, I kind of had a rough living situation at the time, and my job wasn't the greatest, and I was kind of had some colleagues that I was frustrated with. But for weeks it was like I had this peace because I was like, Christ loves us, like I just floated through the world. And so that was an amazing time.
So that was kind of like a real life experience of the theology of the icon.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Like when people say they're windows into heaven, it's like, yes. I mean, for me in that moment, it was truly a window into heaven. And so that was just, it was
So
incredible, and I felt unworthy too. You know what I mean? To be able to witness that. But
So they say that when you venerate the icon, then you're venerating the person that's being depicted, not the wood and so on. And
exactly.
so you
Yeah.
had that experience of,
Yeah.
yeah,
And that's
that's
something
neat.
that I had wrestled with coming from Protestantism, is venerating icons. Because for me, I thought, I don't know, this kind of seems like a little bit idolatry. I don't know. And I had, up to that point, had not really had a relationship with the Theotokos. I knew that we should pray to her, and I knew that she would intercede for us before her son and our God. And so, I prayed to her, but I didn't really have a relationship with her. And it kind of, I don't say bugged me, but it's something I knew I needed to figure out. And I remember that very first Orthodox church I went into in New Hampshire, everyone was lining up to venerate the cross, and I was kind of meekly standing in the back. And I remember the priest, everyone had kissed it, and he saw me standing in the back, and he held up the cross and he said, "It won't hurt you." And I was, "That's true. It won't hurt me." And so I went up and I kissed the cross, but this was, from that moment on, I realized that the Theotokos was not just a doctrine. It was she is a person, and she loves us and she intercedes for us, and she is our mother. And for me, that moment of experiencing her and experiencing her love for me was incredible. And it really changed my perspective on the saints, because it was something more before then that I had to accept. And then it was something that I had experienced. So it was a very profound experience for me. But then following that, I got to go to Israel. My girlfriend at the time was getting her doctorate, her MD, in Israel, and so I went over there for a month, and it's a surreal place because, these places exist. When you're standing next to the Sea of Galilee, it is the same Sea of Galilee. And just the miracles everywhere. I remember going into the Holy Sepulchre, the tomb of Christ, and you walk in and there's just a stone that they laid him on, and there's just myrrh coming out of it, and you're like, "Hey, what is this?" And they're like, "Well, myrrh comes out of it." And you're like, "Have you told anyone?" And they're like, "Well, it's the rock that Jesus laid on, so obviously myrrh is going to come out of it." And you're like, "Oh, okay. I guess there's just." And my girlfriend at the time, she had a nun friend, and she stayed in her cell with her, and every single icon was streaming myrrh, and her nun was like, "Well, I just haven't told anyone because, it's just kind of an everyday occurrence. It's the Holy Land. Um, just incredible stories here and there. I mean, I could fill a book with the stories that I heard, but one experience that was particularly profound for me was we visited the well that the Annunciation occurred at. And prior to this,
And the Annunciation is,
the Annunciation is the angel Gabriel coming to the Theotokos, Mary, and telling her, "Blessed art thou among women, and announcing the incarnation of Christ, and then her responding to that, accepting that for herself. And so it's a very important moment in our church. And one of the things that I think to me is significant about the differences between Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism is that doctrine of Immaculate Conception is not that the Theotokos bore Christ as a virgin, but that she was free of sin, that she was this somehow superhuman vessel that contained Christ.
Yeah, she didn't even have like original sin, right?
Yeah, and it kind of makes her a superhero, and in Orthodoxy, she is viewed as a woman who said yes to God. And for me, that was
Yeah,
much
she wasn't really like us.
right.
She was something
Exactly.
other than us. Yeah.
Yeah, and so the Orthodox view was so much more tangible, and it was somebody, hey, here is an example of a human who said yes, the new Eve. And so prior to that, we were staying in Haifa, which is on the sea, and I was down by the ocean looking at dolphins, eating kebab, and having coffee, really good coffee. And Israel's funny; they really like their dogs, but there's just cats everywhere in the streets. And so I would sit on the rocks at sunset, and this little black and orange cat would come out of the rocks. It was all dirty and hungry, and I didn't have any food for it. But unlike the other cats, it would like to hang out with me. And so I would just pet it and watch the sunset every day. And one day I thought, I want to feed this I want to feed this cat. So I looked around in the rocks. I found an old dead fish, kind of gross, dried out. So I broke it open so the cat could eat it. And as I broke it open, one of the spines stabbed my thumb. And I said, "Ooh, that hurts." And I fed the cat this, fish. Didn't think much of it. A few days go by, starts to get infected. It's getting worse and worse. I'm kind of hiding it from my, medical school girlfriend at the time. I don't want her to find out about it. We get to this, the town that the Annunciation happens in, and which is Nazareth. And we are it's predominantly an Arabic town, and we're getting out of the car, and I remember she saw my thumb and was like, "That's horrible. Like it's purple. The gash is now like a half an inch long. Like we need to treat this." And she's kind of chastising me, and I'm like, "Oh, whatever." And she's like, "No, we need to disinfect it, wrap it. Like we're gonna do it when we get home." So she's kind of mad, and I was like, "Whatever." So we're walking down, and we go into the church, and of course there's the well that the Theotokos was next to when this occurred. You see it in the icon, and there's water in the well, and so we're being Orthodox. Hey, holy water. So we just start drinking it. And there's a sign that's like, "Don't drink the water." And so we're like, "It's fine." So we drink some, and I remember I got some on my hand. Didn't think too much about it. And then we went to walk around and went into the markets, and I actually bought the prayer rug that we use every night there. And I'm walking, and I look at my thumb, and it looks like this. I mean, it's completely healed. There's not even a scar to this day. And I swear it was purple. There was a gash. It was open to the point that I got chastised by my girlfriend about it. And I was just staring at disbelief. And I showed my girlfriend, and she was like, "No, it was the other thumb." And I was like, "No, look, they're both completely restored." And that was just, it's one thing to see some smoke behind the altar that maybe forms into the shape of an icon or something, or to kind of see this or that, but to something in your physical body to change and to be fully restored. I mean, you feel like those stories in the Bible. It's not some fantastical thing. It's a very real, concrete thing, and that's something that the Holy Land really hits you with. Is that they're dusty streets, right? There's stones on the ground. These are places that Christ walked, and people interacted with Christ face to face. And going into the tomb of the Holy Sepulchre is just a surreal experience to be in a tomb and to remember, hey, when we sing those hymns in Holy Week about the myrrh-bearing women going to the tomb, I'm kneeling in the tomb of Christ right now. Like I am where it happened. And it's surreal because it's so concrete and it confronts you in such a real way. So coming back from that, I came to grad school at Penn State, and I was here for 3 years. COVID happened. Difficult time for me to stay connected. I tried to do as much church through Zoom, but in Orthodoxy, it's really something you have to participate in. And I remember my landlords that Pascha at Easter, I walked around our little house 3 times with a candle. They probably thought I was crazy. But I was trying everything I could to move back to New England because that felt like home to me. That was my friend Michael and I always refer to it to Vermont as the promised land. And when I moved back there, I applied to, again, hundreds of jobs. I thought, now I have a master's, I'll get them. And the only job I was offered was, again, the highest paying and perfectly aligned for what I wanted to do in a career with a foot in wildlife, a foot in forestry. But it was back in State College. And I thought, oh, Lord, like, I've just been trying to get out of there for 3 years. Why bring me back to this place? And then I remembered that the promised land for Moses, he couldn't enter it, and so I thought, well, maybe this is right, and so I said, Lord, if you're leading me here, I will go, but help me to know if it's the right decision. And I came back, and it was, I think, 3 months later that I was in a grocery store, and I met a cute girl who drove a Mini Cooper, and it turned out to be my future wife. And so it was very kind of Hallmark card greeting, kind of meeting in a grocery store. But that's been my journey into Orthodoxy, through Orthodoxy, and then to meet my wife. But one thing I wanted to point out in all of that is, I bring up these miracles not to make folks that have not experienced miraculous things feel any less for not having experienced them, because I'm unworthy to have experienced these miracles myself. But I've read, a lot of people that have become Christian, have come into the church, that there is sometimes a period where God blesses them with amazing things to show them, for whatever reason, to strengthen their relationship with Him. But then there's a time where there's this kind of drawing back, and it for me, it's been most important to look at figures in the church who have fought the good fight, as St. Paul says. And I think that for me, that early time being Orthodox, it was incredible, and I was seeking God. And it was in those times that I was seeking God with my whole heart, my soul, and my body that I encountered Him. And I think that we need to learn and practice continuing that throughout our faith, but also accepting those quiet times where we carry our cross, but we don't carry it ourselves. We carry it with Christ. And it's that journey, I think, that is really important to focus on. But in all of that, that's me. But I want to give my wife a chance to then hand the baton off, because I guess chronologically now we have arrived at Sophia's entrance.
And I'm happy to start. I don't know if you guys have any clarifying questions for Scott or anything like that.
No, I think that was pretty good. That is interesting, with Christ and the bread and everything. And you said, and he clarified it and made it more difficult to believe.
Yes.
And then didn't run after them whenever they said, "I'll see you later." They didn't go running after them. It was just, well, okay. I don't know what he was thinking, but it comes across as well. I'm not going to run after you. I'm not going to force you to believe this, but this is what it is.
And even the disciples, right? I mean, even the disciples says, this is a hard teaching, and I think that's the best way to sum it up. And I think that what I was finding in my own journey between, I had considered Lutheranism because I thought, well, that's kind of halfway there. And then I considered Roman Catholicism. And I think that there's different sides trying to define it too concretely. And I think that, the faith of the apostles, right? This is a hard teaching, but you have the words of eternal life, right? I mean, this is Christ telling us. And I think that comfort with the mystery, and I mean, that's why we call the sacraments, the mysteries, the holy mysteries of the church, that comfort with letting God do His thing and accepting it, is kind of an important thing. We don't have to, through phenomenology or some complex epistemology, explain what is exactly going on. We can accept God for who He is and what He's doing. And I think it is very interesting to me that language plays such a big part into how people interpret that verse, because, the Anglophone world, which has quite a few denominations of Protestantism, tends to translate that verse as eat and eat, right? And they're two very different words, two very different meanings, but these translations are perhaps influencing the way that people are perceiving the words of Christ. And when you go to the Greek, you are confronted with a very different reality.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know that. But, the Roman Catholics get themselves in, and Protestants too, get themselves into trouble by trying to rationalize everything.
Mhm.
And I think you're right. In Orthodoxy, the real theologians that we look to are the experiential ones, the ones that have experienced God. And they don't necessarily try to rationalize the whole thing. They just say this is what the truth is, and we don't have to understand it all, like you said. I mean, how do you understand, bread and wine becoming the body and blood of Christ? But that's the experience of the church and experience of the experiential theologians, and so we accept it. So, like, I think you're right. In Orthodoxy, a couple things. In Orthodoxy, you don't have to understand everything. You just have to accept it as true to become Orthodox. And there's another thing that you said there that I was going to comment on. It left me, as it oftentimes does.
Well,
I think about it. I'll interrupt something.
I like what you say about, experiential theologians, because I forget which saint it is, but there's a saint of the church that says a theologian is one who prays, and so for me, that has been, I would say, more productive for my understanding of theology than any, logicking could have gotten me, is that experience of prayer and written prayer is something that is unique, coming from Protestantism into Orthodoxy, having written prayers and then having to read the same prayers every night. Although, you could say, well, you read the same thing, doesn't mean anything. But really what you're doing is God is teaching you how to interact with him correctly, how to draw into that right relationship with God. And the words that the saints have handed down to us in a lot of these written prayers are so expertly express God that through these prayers we orient ourselves correctly to him.
Yeah, it comes from their experience.
Mm-hmm.
I think I remember what I was going to say. Oftentimes, when you come into Orthodoxy, there's a bit of a honeymoon period. Like,
Sure.
kind of, you went through it. I went through what you did, but it was still kind of a honeymoon period. But then the tough work comes, because you got to go from where you are to God likeness, which means you got to be willing to see your sin. You got to be willing to do our repentance, and so God gives us this little taste of things, I think, in the beginning, to kind of hold us through when you have to go through all the battles and the fights and everything that you have to do to get from where you are to where you want to be.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Absolutely. Yeah.
in any case. All right,
Well,
Sophia.
Um, well, I'm glad Scott went first, because I would probably not be Orthodox if it were not for Scott. I was baptized and raised and confirmed and very involved with the Presbyterian Church, PCUSA, technically. And I was very happy there. And my mother was Presbyterian and my grandfather was Presbyterian, and I had no intent to leave. I also played around with the idea of potentially becoming a minister of some part. I was singing in the choir. I was involved in all the youth groups. And I remember thinking at one point, because they would have these new member Sundays when people would come in, and one day we like switched up the tables and we were encouraged to share our like come to Jesus stories. And I remember thinking it was kind of odd for me, because I didn't have a come to Jesus moment. My mom didn't have a come to Jesus moment. We had just like always been there. We had always been part of the church, and we're like, well, this was given to us. This is truth. We believe it, and like we don't need a miracle to prove this to us, kind of thing. Like, we're happy to be there. And I don't know if justified is the right word, but I likened it to the story of I guess the three laborers. I'm probably not calling it correctly, but where one comes in the morning and agrees to work for the day's wages, and then one comes in the afternoon and agrees to work for the day's wages, and one comes in the evening, and at the end of the day they all get the day's wages. And my mom and I just looked at each other and we're like, well, I guess we're the ones that came in the morning, like we all get to participate in God's gifts, right? But like we don't have to like come along, like we're fortunate enough to be here from the beginning. So it made the conversion process very difficult for proud, staunch Presbyterian little me. But I had noticed that when I had gone off to college, I had started trying to attend some other churches. And that was when I kind of started getting my first taste of the difference in denominations sorts of things. And when I was...
So when you went to college, did you come to Penn State first, or did you come to Penn State as a grad student?
Grad school for Penn State. I went to college down at JMU, James Madison University.
Oh, okay. Oh, my nephew went there.
Yeah, it's a great school.
Oh.
But so part of my part of my confirmation process in Presbyterianism was they took us on this little retreat and they had us attend church in this little stone chapel, and everyone was standing and the priest was facing the other way and was speaking Latin, and there was a lot of incense, and they were like, this is what the Presbyterian Church fought against, like these are the injustices of the like ecclesiastical church, and basically, like explaining like what the differences were, and like what Presbyterianism was and what like Roman Catholicism like got wrong kind of thing, right? And the things that we the Reformation was about. And so not only was I staunchly Presbyterian, but I was really not Catholic. I really did not. I was almost anti-Catholic. I'm still a little anti-Roman Catholic. But it was funny because my first boyfriend, I've only had 3 serious relationships, and the first one, he was baptized Catholic, but he was kind of becoming an atheist. And then my second serious relationship, he was baptized Catholic, and they still considered themselves Catholic, but they didn't go to their local church because they didn't like the priest. So they like just kind of stopped attending, but they still very much identified and like believed in God and that kind of thing. And so then when Scott came along and he was like, not only not Roman Catholic, but now he was like Orthodox, like Catholic and I was like, all right, God, there's a trend here. But anyway, that was still a while yet. But my first kind of disenfranchising with the Presbyterian Church was when I was in college down in Harrisonburg, and I started trying to find another church, because my home church was a wonderful place. It was, even though it was like in the heart of DC, because I went to Georgetown Presbyterian Church, they were very, very strict about not including politics in their churching. So you would get very Bible focused, very religion heavy. So when we went to church, it was like for Jesus, it was for God, Trinitarian. They didn't sugarcoat anything, right? It was definitely very Presbyterian, but like it was not about the feelings of the day. It was, this is the doctrine and this is what we're here to learn about. So when I started trying to find churches down in Harrisonburg, I was like, why are there politics in my sermons? And not only that, but like, I don't think that's exactly what Jesus said that you are putting in your sermons, And so like, I was getting upset with, yeah.
Are these Presbyterian churches?
Yeah, so I was PCUSA, so I looked for
Is that the conservative part of
PCUSA is
Presbyterian?
technically the more liberal church.
Okay.
And you can find denominations that go either way, but PCUSA is technically a more liberal church. And so that was definitely a struggle I was coming across. That, and also I didn't like the churches that I was going to, I didn't like the sing-songy music. So I had very kind of specific requirements that I was looking for. I wanted the organ music, I wanted the hymns that we would sing, that kind of thing. So I didn't want any I didn't want the what is it called? The
new worship
music. Yeah, the new worship music, those kinds of worship bands, that kind of thing. I was like, that's not for me. I want more traditional church. So anyway, with all this, I didn't really go to church much. The one church that I did find that I liked was like half-hour away, and I also had frisbee practice on Sundays that was making it difficult, and so I ended up not really going to church when I was at college. I would still attend when I would come home, but when I was away, I didn't. And this got particularly worse when I went to grad school, and there was a church, and I would actually go to this church like every Sunday because it was like less than a mile from home. I literally passed it when I walked to campus every day. But the politics in these sermons were so bad that I would attend the church because it was a good thing to go to church, and I would bring a letter and I would write my mom during the sermon and be like, you would not believe what this man is saying right now.
This is in State College? This is at Penn State? What church was that?
This is the First Presbyterian Church on Beaver.
On Beaver Avenue.
Yeah. And I like the music for the most part. Like I like the choir director and stuff like that. But yeah, I just spent the entire time just like ripping the sermon apart. I was like, there's no theology in here. Like Jesus told us to love the poor. He didn't tell us how to love the poor, like that kind of thing. And it's like, I don't remember carbon being talked about in the Bible, like that sort of stuff, And so it was about this time that I met Scott, because I started grad school in 2019. And then 2020, I went home and I did basically half the year at home. And then it was, I guess, the spring of 2021, we met in the church, or not in the church, we met at the grocery store. And we agreed to see each other again shortly thereafter. And that first walk that we had, Scott,
About 6 hours of talking.
yeah, it was like a good solid 4-hour walk, chatting the entire time, and a large chunk of it was definitely dedicated to Scott's Orthodox journey. So much of what you heard here tonight, I also was regaled with. And so it was a lot. I was like, okay, this man is like certainly intense in his faith, but it was also very comforting, because Scott was the first person that I felt like I could talk unapologetically with about God. I feel like anyone else, like, I would have to kind of caveat with, well, I believe that God exists, or, well, I believe this kind of thing. But with Scott, it was just like, no, God is real, God exists, and we can talk about him, because that's already established. And so the theological conversations that we would have were really freeing, and that was very nice. And so it was about this time he was encouraging me to kind of like, I guess, look deeper into my faith, because I was upset with the Presbyterian Church, but I was too much of a Presbyterian in my bones to just abandon it. I was like, no, this is like, I really think Presbyterianism is the way to go. But like, I started looking into what the church believed, and I liked it less and less, and I was like, well, that doesn't make any sense, like theologically or biblically. The other thing I got through talking with Scott was a lot of my understandings of the like tulip Calvinism were really very Orthodox in their understanding, right? So things like probably the best example is predestination, right? Which is kind of one of the hardest things for Presbyterians to grasp. I remember when I was in my confirmation class, I was like, this is a hard teaching, right? Kind of thing. And they're like, well, it's not, the point isn't like God makes good people and God makes bad people. The point is that you are not in charge of your salvation. God is the one that is in charge of your salvation. And so you will ultimately be saved through the grace of God. And so you don't have to worry about working for your salvation. You can just pay attention to being a good person. And so in that case, in that sense, it was kind of very Orthodox to me. Even though it didn't have as much of a works component to it, it was less like some people are destined for good, some people are destined for evil. It is more so like your job is to just be a good person and to follow, what Christ has told you. And God is ultimately the judge, right? And that's the person that you need to worry about. So I was like, so there were a lot of things that were kind of Orthodox in their understanding, because those things make more sense, right? And like Orthodoxy, as Scott says, allows a lot of the teachings in the Bible to make sense, right? Because otherwise they can be difficult, they can be confusing, particularly when you throw Protestant twists on them. And so there were a lot of things that, through talking with Scott, and admittedly through listening to Lord of Spirits, kind of just helped solidify and clarify a lot of church teachings and things like that. And so I basically got to a point where I couldn't go back to the PCUSA.
You had marinated for too long.
Yeah. And like I couldn't hop straight into Orthodoxy either, even though Scott like tried to get me to go to church a couple of times. So I stopped going to the PCUSA church, which had been relatively easy because they had closed down for COVID. So I already wasn't going. So this was kind of like me getting back into church. And so the first thing I did was I went to the Orthodox Presbyterian Reformed church that was down the street. And I was like, well, this has got to be closer, right? And so I went for one service, and I was like, yep, nope, this is not the church.
A side fun fact is that they believe it is immoral to vote because the Constitution of the United States does not acknowledge Jesus Christ as the King of America.
Yeah, and so
that's interesting way of thinking about it.
Very specific American legal theology.
Well, and it was funny too, because like I was attending and like I had just gotten okay with like icons and things like that, because the idea of like, well, you're not worshiping the image, you're like, this is like it's like a photo, right? And I was like, well, I look at photos and I pray to people that have died and stuff like this, so like that's not a big disconnect for me. And that morning they were having like an adult ed about like iconoclasm and like why images are bad. And the sermon that day was like the minister was complaining about the fact that his Bible that his wife got him had a cross on it. He's like, I'd rather there were no images at all. I was like, oh, okay, this is a little intense. And like their music was, they only sang psalms. And so they didn't have like, so they weren't going to be singing any of the hymns either. And I was like, I'm not sure this is quite right either. So at that point, I just started going to church with Scott. And yeah, it was very uncomfortable for me. I don't like swaying. I don't like touching people. And not that you do that in the Orthodox Church, but like my Presbyterian church, it was like white walls. You sit in your pew, you stand for the hymns, you sit, you listen, you stand, you sit, and then you go home. And Orthodoxy being so foreign to me was not a comfort. I know some people are like, oh, this is like so mystical and like it just feels right. And for me, I was like, this is not church. This is not, I can't sing along. And that was like one of the more frustrating things, because I find myself just getting like angry in the service, because like I believed the Nicene Creed, like we would recite that in the Presbyterian church whenever we would do communion. I believed, we said the Our Father, like on like all the things, there were a lot of things that, lined up, and I was like really struggling with like the differences and why those differences were so important. But then with things like the Our Father and the Creed, like because the music was different and because there weren't any hymn books or anything like that, I couldn't even participate. So I was frustrated at the fact that I wasn't a good enough Christian to commune, right? Which is kind of how you see it in the Presbyterian church, because they have like open communion, right? Like if you are a Christian, you can commune. But so first off, I'm not able to take communion, which was, a slap to my prideful face. And then to not even be able to say the creed or to say the Our Father together, it was just,
because you didn't know the music.
yeah, because I didn't know the music. It made me feel, it just made me question my identity as a Christian. Like what have I been doing?
So it's not like just want to clarify, it's not like you're not allowed to sing along in the Orthodox Church. You just didn't know the music, so you didn't have.
Correct. So like
Right.
here are things that like I could do, but I didn't know them, and there wasn't like music provided to people either, because like in the Protestant churches you have the hymn book so everyone can read the music. So because I wasn't in the choir at the time, I didn't know what the music was. So here we're getting to parts of the service that I actually can like profess and confess and all these things, and I physically can't do it because I don't know how, and it made me question my validity as a Christian. Like this last like 26 years, it's like, okay, you're telling me that I'm not good enough to commune. I can't even recite the creeds with you guys. Like I'm not familiar with what's going on here. I'm so, I was just so frustrated. And I remember like, yeah, it was just a really tough time and tough period in my life, because it was the death of my former identity, because I was always a Presbyterian, I was always a Christian, and this like Orthodoxy being thrust in my life, which I was very resentful for a while too, because it's like, well, now I know the truth, so I can't turn back, right? But like I don't want to be here, so like it's just tearing me from the inside. And poor Scott was doing his darndest to, I guess, support me throughout this whole thing. And he had spoken multiple times about how difficult of a process it was for him, because he could see how hard it was for me and how painful of a process it was for me.
But in that, I mean, that as a side note, I mean, that's how I knew to marry Sophia. I mean, here I found somebody who, it was a struggle, but it was a struggle that I felt that I was made for. Like God had sent this person into my life, and that this was, I would say my cross to bear. But I remember in marriage counseling, Father Ignatius said, oh, it's awful. Sometimes people view their spouses as a cross to bear. And I thought, but Father, through the cross, joy has come into the world. And so for me, it made my decision to marry Sophia very clear. I never felt that way about anyone, in that here's somebody who, despite their struggles, despite the things that they're facing, I know that I am called to help them with this, And so even though it was a difficult process for both of us, I could feel Christ very close in that process.
Yeah. And I think the day that it all just kind of like, I accepted it, because that tends to be how I deal with things that I either new information or like truths that I don't want to acknowledge, is I struggle with it for a while. I get really angry and upset about it, and then I just like kind of resign myself to it. So the resignation to Orthodoxy was imminent. It was coming. But it was going to be very painful to get there, and for me to like set my pride aside. And that was definitely a big part, was like asking God to help me, set him before myself, sorts of things, and my identity, right? Orthodoxy before my identity. And I think kind of the epiphany moment that I had was, we were having coffee one day, and I had just realized that like throughout my life, I had been praying to God to help me believe, and to guide me, and to I don't even remember exactly what I said. I'm sorry. I'm like 6, almost 7 months pregnant, and gray matter apparently loses. So I'm like losing all of my words.
I think I remember the coffee that you're talking about.
Yeah.
It was at the Lamont, the cafe at Lamont.
Cafe Lamont.
And I remember we were sitting in the grass, and you had prayed that this was a watershed moment. We should remember the phrasing.
Yeah, I should.
You can edit this with the magic of movie
It's
editing.
funny. Sophia's 6 or 7 months pregnant, and I'm 67. We're kind of on the same mental.
Yeah. So it's basically like I was praying. If you remember.
Oh, it was something about like I was the answer to the prayer. So what was that?
Yeah. So, and like I was praying to God to like, I don't know. I'm so sorry, because I had this verbiage. It was like perfectly clear, because it was a prayer that I was praying for like all the time up until this point. And I guess I haven't felt the need to pray it lately.
It's been fulfilled, I guess. Yeah.
But it was something along the lines of help my disbelief, right? Like, because it's hard in today's modern era to like fully trust and to fully believe. And so I was like, I believe, help my disbelief. But also like,
it's gotta show me the truth, right? I mean, and
kind of show me the truth, give me the strength to pursue the truth as well, right? Because it's one thing to understand what's the right thing to do, it's the other thing to actually go through and pursue it. And I'm really kicking myself that I can't remember the exact phraseology, because it really was perfect.
well, it was particularly profound for me, because I remember that you had mentioned this early on our first date when we went for that very long walk. I had expressed to Sophia that I used to pray at night to God to help me believe that he was real, which is kind of an interesting prayer to ask God to help you believe that the God that you're praying to is real. And when I became Orthodoxy, my prayers pivoted, because it was, and I think Sophia had expressed this when she had first met me. It was not so much, the question is not so much, is God real? The question, the impetus is, yes, God is here. What are you going to do about it? And so my prayers after I became Orthodox was, God, help me become the man that you created me to be. And so that kind of pivot in this, okay, now we have a relationship, and help me to become who you created me to be in this life. Help me to correct myself to fulfill that will. I used to ask God, what is your will for my life? Just tell me, I'll do it. I just wanted God to open the heavens and say, hey, do this, and then close, and then I would just do it, But instead, it wasn't telling me to do something. It was that desire for a relationship. And at this point, through the magic of movie editing, I'll come back to Sophia's, telos, I guess, if that's the term, because it is very related. I had forgotten to explain the thesis of my journey to Orthodoxy. If you'll recall that first prayer that I prayed on the highway, if this is love, let it grow. If it's not, teach me what love is. And when you think about the events that followed that, and I had fallen head over heels for somebody. I had loved them unconditionally, right? Because they did not really reciprocate that love, and it injured me, and yet I persisted. I loved unconditionally, and that was handed back to me with rejection, right? With somebody who is turning away continually, 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 to the point of just running off and leaving me. And then I realized in the desert that this is what I had done to God, is that God had wanted a relationship with me. He had created me and wanted me to dwell with him. And my whole life I had just put him off. I had just kept him at arm's length. I had done my own thing. I had put other desires before him. And it was through that process, as painful as it was, of going to the desert, that I was able to clear my mind and look back and say, oh, you have shown me what it means to unconditionally love somebody who continually runs off from you. And I identified that with myself and my own relationship with God. And what was profound for me in meeting Sophia is that in that first walk, when we discussed, what do you pray when you pray to God? And I had explained that I had pivoted from asking God to prove himself to me, or to just tell me what he wanted me to do, and instead turned it into that more relational prayer of help me to become who you created me to be. Sophia had this prayer of, Lord, teach me the truth and give me the strength and the courage to do it, to live it out.
Yes.
I can't remember where that prayer is. This would be a really good podcast if we can remember that prayer is.
Yeah, but anyway, so the culmination of all of that was that at that coffee, I basically realized that depending on how you wanted to look at it, Scott was the answer to that prayer. God had put him in my life and had introduced Orthodoxy to me through him, and had encouraged me on this journey and supported me. And even though it was like an incredibly difficult and painful experience, it was the answer to what I had asked for. And it brought to mind a sermon that my Presbyterian minister had said one Christmas, which was, God doesn't always give you the gift doesn't always give you what you want, but he gives you what you need. And so that was it. Again, why like leaving that Presbyterian church was so hard for me, because it was like, yes, like that is that is still true. And so I don't think I would have ever wanted to become Orthodox, but I needed it, and so here I am.
And I remember up until that point, Sophia had said a lot, I would not be Orthodox if it weren't for you. And she was saying it in the sense of, this is kind of predicated on your will or what you are doing. And I remember at that moment, I think we kind of realized, I think I mentioned to you, I said, well, the world would not be Orthodox if it were not for the apostles, right? I mean, God uses people, and I'm a sinner, but I think that he sent me to you to help guide you, and to, not just take that faith and just kind of hold it inside of myself, but to share it with you. And then, through the sacrament of holy matrimony, share it with the world,
So after that kind of coffee conversation, that was my breaking point. That was when I resolved, when I settled and resolved. And it was just kind of culminating to chrismation after that. I remember chrismation was very important to me. I didn't want to be baptized, again, probably because of a pride thing, but my baptism was important to me because it was like a symbol of my Christianity again. And by the time chrismation came around, I was like, if I need to be baptized, that's okay. But I know like for like up until that, it was like I would have been very, very upset, and my pride would have been very, very hurt, which is of course a very dangerous thing. My pride has been a very large obstacle in this whole journey. But I was happy to be chrismated. And then yeah, after that I just kind of dove in. I'm very fortunate that Scott had an early Orthodox experience with a lot of cradle Orthodox, so he doesn't really have that convertitis, which I know I was kind of afraid of getting. So it's nice that we've been able to kind of become Orthodox, but not to be super outwardly Orthodox. It's like we've been able to just kind of come in and be like, this is truth. and we live it, right? But we live it in a human way.
And I think, yeah, and not outward in the sense that we feel like we need to logically explain to every person in our life that they're incorrect, and that we need to explain to them why they need to arrive at the same logical conclusion that orthodoxy is truth. It's more that, you know, as you mentioned, my old church would there were a lot of Russians that had fled Russia before the revolution, and so they had a very interesting perspective. But they lived Orthodoxy from also a culturally Orthodox perspective, and so they I guess the way that I would phrase is that they didn't feel like they needed to prove anything to anyone, that they lived their life, and they still evangelized in a way, in the sense that their lives and their interactions and their nexus of relationships with everyone that they came into contact with were ultimately sanctifying. But there wasn't this kind of I need to convince somebody for my own justification, if that makes sense.
So to kind of, I guess, wrap up myself, I still haven't had a come to Jesus moment. It's been now instead of being like born into it, it's been a struggle process of gradually accepting, denying, and then accepting again and resigning, until just kind of being like, all right, if orthodoxy is true, let me accept it. And I did not have as big of a desire for the Eucharist. It was actually one of the hardest things that I had. And I don't know if this is like a good thing, but even when I was being chrismated, I was like, I don't know about the Eucharist, but I understand that it's Orthodox theology, and therefore I must accept, right? And I was like, that's a good enough place for me right now. If I go on to understand it more later, then God's will be done.
And I think that was an important thing. Like the night before Sophia's chrismation, we had talked late into the night about struggling with the admitting and taking ownership of what it means to believe in the true presence of Christ in the Eucharist. And I remember she, maybe somewhat tearfully admitted to me, she was like, I don't understand it. And I said, then you're perfect. I said, yeah, that is Orthodox. To say that you can comprehend what it is in your mind is probably not true, right? I mean, we accept it because it is truth, and there are ways of explaining it. There are ways of feeling it, but it is truth, and we don't feel like we need to logically explain it in order for it to be true.
Yeah. And the OCA was very helpful. Scott encouraged me to get involved with the OCA, so I was.
OCF.
Sorry, OCF. So that certainly helped me.
Which is
the Orthodox
OCF is
Fellowship, which is
Student
the
Fellowship.
on-campus Orthodox group. Although they were very good about keeping ties with the with Holy Trinity, the local church. So we'd have lovely conversations, lots of fun things. Shout out to Nate Kopchak, who ran it that year. But that got me involved as well, and so getting familiar with the church community helps, as much as anything does, because it starts to make this foreign Orthodox environment feel more like home. I got involved with the choir, so I could actually sing all the music. That was important to me. And those are all like the small things building up. And I guess like in this last year, yeah, as I said, I still haven't really had like no particular like miracles like Scott's had, like no miraculous healings, no like visions of God or anything like that. No, like thankfully no like catastrophic.
Well,
I'm getting that to just a second.
Yeah.
Like this one story about like be careful if you ask God for a sign, because he'll show it to you. You might just not like how he shows it. So nothing like that. I've been very cautious about asking God for signs. But yeah, so this year in July, I guess I've had no like big like miracle moments, kind of like the ones that Scott talked about, but I have been very purposeful about like small miracles, like is it a coincidence or is it a miracle, right? And just kind of orienting yourself to kind of the miracle side allows you to see God working in everything, right? So like maybe you're missing your bus, but turns out the bus is late. Coincidence, miracle, depends how you want to like classify it, And so I have been trying to like put those small things more towards the miracle side, right? And just kind of allowing God to work in positive things and negative things and just trying to see them as blessings. And to I think what Scott was trying to get to was in late July this year, we got in a pretty bad motorcycle accident. And so we were riding on a motorcycle and we took this sharp turn, came up out of nowhere, and we ended up hitting the brake, which caused the bike to skid. And Scott and the bike skid away, but I went into the front of an oncoming car. And I shattered one of my vertebrae, burst fracture of one of my spinal vertebrae. I broke most of my ribs, and the majority of them were broken in more than one spot. I fractured my left scapula. I had punctured lungs, and I had something broken on almost every other one of my vertebrae. So it was pretty serious. And I dissected my carotid arteries, and
Which
You
means
did what?
the walls of the carotid arteries delaminated, so they kind of were damaged.
yeah, so the inner wall and the outer wall of the arteries separated, so it makes a bit of a constriction. So it basically equates to like a stroke risk, because you have your vein is constricted a little bit where that separation occurs.
This is what it looked like. I don't know if this actually comes through at all, but it's pretty bad.
Yeah.
So basically, one, a miracle that we're alive, right? Or I guess that I'm alive,
And
because I got hit head on by this car, and then potentially
That's for everything you said, that sounds pretty miraculous that you're alive. I'd say.
Yeah. And so yeah, so we think I was hit and maybe also run over. I'm not sure because God is good and he let me black out before I actually hit anything. But upon waking up, they like
I mean, for me, because I was there, as Sophia said, she, I don't want to say that she was the fortunate one, but she didn't have to experience the most kind of graphic part of it. I dragged her out of the road, flipped her over, dragged her out, quite a scene. And
which
it's
he like maybe shouldn't have done because of the spinal injury, but it was on the like in the middle of the road on a blind turn, so
Yeah.
like he didn't want
So
to
it's
leave me there.
incredible that we didn't damage the spinal cord, in that moment. But in that moment, my wife is lifeless in the road, and I don't know
Blood.
if she was alive, if she was not alive, what was going on. And I mean, there were some very intense, heartfelt prayers. And for me, there's just this interesting connection again with Theotokos, because ever since, I've been praying for the Theotokos to protect us.
Just a second. You might want to play with Theotokos.
Oh yes, yeah. Just I had this connection with the Theotokos, and I'd been praying for her to protect us.
And the Theotokos. I just want to clarify. The Theotokos means
that's Mary. Yeah.
birth giver of God. Birth giver
Yes.
of God. It's
That's
Greek
right.
word for birth giver of God. Right.
That's right. Yeah. And so I kind of in my prayers had kind of dedicated Sophia's protection to her. And I remember on the side of the road, I cried out and I asked God and to save us, even though we were sinners. And it was, I guess when Sophia started breathing and came to and said that her back hurt, and they took her away, flew away on a helicopter. It was not until later that we discovered that that day is the feast day of Saint Pantaleon, the great healer. And so that was a pretty powerful kind of discovery that we made. But I guess it wasn't until much later that we talked with the surgeon, and in talking with him, Sophia had been feeling some pains, and he had said, well, there might be some pain forever, and that kind of made her sad. And then he wanted to clarify. He said, to clarify, I thought you were paralyzed when I saw your chart. He looked at the X-ray, the one that we kind of blurry held up to the camera just now, and he said, looking at the spinal cord, everyone I've seen like this is paralyzed. I don't know why you're moving. I don't know why you're walking, but we had a priest come and pray, and perform the service of unction, and they performed surgery, and within 2 days she was standing, and taking a few steps. So
well, and the other miracle too is I was pregnant at the time.
Yeah, it turns out she was pregnant.
Yeah, and
Oh, you were pregnant at the time of
baby.
the accident. That's
Yeah.
interesting.
So
That's
not only
amazing.
did I
You said you hadn't
survive,
experienced any miracles, then you tell us miracle after miracle after miracle.
well, so like I wasn't, like any visions or anything or like miraculous healings, right? Because
Well, I don't
I
know.
am
If
still
you're
in the
supposed to be
process of
paralyzed, then you're
healing.
not.
Has been a long process for sure. But it's been, a very joyous one. And a blessing in the sense, again, if anyone listens to Lord of Spirits, one of their episodes talks about what the term blessing means. And one of the um, definitions based on like the Hebrew and Greek, if you're looking into it, talks about orientation. Blessing is more so like an orientation, which is why we can say things like, bless the Lord, oh my soul, right? Because blessings are more than just a gift from God. That's certainly a part of it, but there is this orienting sense.
And that comes from the root itself. I mean,
If you want to get
blessing,
into that.
yeah, blessing in Hebrew, the prayer, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu. That Baruch comes from the root, the Barak, which means to kneel. So it's interesting that it has this concept of changing your bodily position.
Yeah.
And a blessing is something that reorients us to God. And I mean, through this process, I think we can both say that this has only brought us closer together,
Yeah.
first year of marriage, almost at that point, almost at our 1 year anniversary. And it was a strange thing to, psychologically process, but I tell people, even though it was bad, it was one of the best things to happen because, we only have such a closer relationship with Christ and with each other. And that has been such a blessing to really understand what is so important in life and to understand that life is not just a guarantee and that we should appreciate what we have. And yes, we feel very, very blessed.
Yes, it is certainly a miracle, and God is certainly very good.
Especially with the baby too. I mean, that
Yeah, was the doctor surprised that the baby wasn't harmed at all?
So they
A
said
little bit. So the OB/GYN at the hospitals explained that at this point it's typically all or nothing because I was about 7 weeks along at the point of the accident, and she said that at this point it's all or nothing. So either the body will abort the baby or you will keep it, and it shouldn't affect development of the child at all. We're not obstetricians, but what we suspect is at that stage the baby is still technically like with the yolk sac and stuff like that, so there's no placenta or anything. So we think that if it was any more developed, you would have something like placental abruption, and so then you would actually have something damaging. But because it was just this little embryo that was just kind of floating around in my body cavity, turned out to be pretty okay. And God's gift is that I guess he made me strong enough to be able to take the trauma of getting hit by something like that, and for my body to be like, nah, we can do this and a baby. We can do it.
and what's funny to me is, in terms of, I guess my faith journey has been marked by pursuing God and then experiencing a lot of things. And I think Sophia's faith journey, I've seen a lot of answered prayers. Because I remember that, when she became Orthodox, she was kind of terrified. There was, I think it's in the sayings of the Desert Fathers, there's this one part that says, if you have an easy life, fall on your face and cry because, it means that, you cannot bear harder temptations, And so she said, well, my life's pretty good.
This is true. This was something that bothered me.
And so she felt this guilt.
Was this before the accident or after the accident?
Yeah.
A little bit.
Before?
And a little bit like after the accident too, because like all things considered, I'm getting away from this with so little inconvenience,
I mean,
right?
did you read that and were concerned that you hadn't gone through any struggles before the accident?
Yes. So I
Okay.
was definitely concerned about that before the accident because I have had a very easy, very blessed life. And it did concern me that, it's like, well, what does this mean that if my faith was truly tested, would I be able to survive something like that? And it's something that I, even questioned after the accident too, because, I'm still walking. I still have the baby. Like I have five vertebrae are fused together, but for the most part, like I'm going to get most of my motion back, and it's going to really have like once I heal from this, it's going to be relatively little inconvenience on my life. And so even that, sometimes I'm like, well, God has been very good to me.
Yeah.
Do I deserve this?
And I remember we were driving back one day, and yeah, Sophia was expressing, like, oh, we're so blessed, like nothing bad has happened to me. And I said, getting hit by a car at 85 miles an hour is pretty bad. I think you received the trial that you were worried about, and you have only grown closer to God. It's okay.
Yeah.
So
I think you said before, or someone said before, be careful what you ask of God because He might give it to you.
yes,
exactly.
But I think a lot of this desert fathers were talking. They outside, yeah, but they were talking more internal struggle.
Yeah.
Your internal struggles. You certainly had a lot of internal struggles coming to Orthodoxy.
Yes.
And you have a lot of internal struggles going on. So
Yeah.
going forward too. So
Yeah, the baby's pushing on those formerly broken ribs, and it does not feel good. But yeah, I think that's all I have to say.
Yeah. Is there any discussion? Any questions? Yeah.
It was interesting when you talk about the Eucharist because I had something similar. That's not an easy thing to believe, right? This is bread and wine. It becomes the body and the blood of Christ. I remember talking to the one who was kind of evangelizing me towards Orthodoxy out on campus. He was saying how he had told me about that. We were having discussions because I didn't believe it, and he did. And he said, I haven't been to take communion for a while. I looked at him and said, do you believe this is Christ and our goal is to become like Christ, and you're not taking this? So if I believe that, I'd take it every week.
And look at you now, Gary.
Yeah. So I don't think for anybody out there, you don't have to understand. I mean, who understands it, right?
Yeah.
But but you're taking in Christ, and the goal is to become God-like or Christ-like. So this is a huge help to that. Whether we feel anything or anything like that doesn't matter because we're taking in Christ, and over time that has an effect on us. So it's one of those things where you don't have to understand everything. Like Scott, how do you understand looking at an icon and seeing, the Mother of God, just right there? You can't rationalize that. And we shouldn't try to rationalize that.
Mm-hmm.
But it's given to us, and if we believe it, at least accept it and try to believe it the best we can, then it'll have its effect on us over time.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that's an important thing to point out. I mean, somebody once told me that the Greek word for faith is not really as straight of a connection to the English word as we understand for faith. Thinking is faith is something that you just believe, that you think about, and the Greek word is a little bit more closely associated with like a practice. And I think that that's something to think about because, like you said, it's a crazy thing to believe, right? I mean, if somebody came up to you and said, this is truly Christ, our God, it would actually be strange to just accept it immediately. And that is something that I used to talk with Sophia about. She would say, it's very hard for me to just accept this. And I would say, well, I'm glad to hear that, because if you did just immediately accept when I came up to you and said, hey, this is truly Christ, and you said, oh, okay, I'd say, really? You just did you think about it? Because it doesn't make any sense. And so that wrestling with God, I think I always used to say, if you're wrestling with God, that means you're very close to God, right? I mean, that's Israel, right? One who wrestles with God. That's in a way that's a good thing, because that means that you're with God in that turmoil. You're trying to figure that out, but not feeling like you need to understand something in order to believe it, and to accept it,
Right. Yeah, and that's the problem with a lot of Roman Catholicism and Protestantism, is trying to rationalize it all.
Yes.
And then you just get kind of, and that's where you get off too, because you start to rationalize.
Yeah.
I use the example of you ever watch golf? I'm kind of weird at that. I watch golf on TV, but the guy is on the tee and he hits the ball and it goes like 300 yards down the fairway. Well, if his swing is off just a little bit, by the time it gets 300 yards, it may be in a different hole somewhere, So when we reason things out too much, when we don't really know what we're doing, our starting point can be a little bit off. Then we're trying to reason out, or maybe the third step's a little bit off. I'm just trying to reason out, and by the time we get to the end, we've got something totally different.
Yeah.
So that's why we look to the experiential theologians, and the academic theologians are supposed to just repeat to us in a way we can understand what the experiential theologians tell us. Because if you try to rationalize this stuff out, you're bound to make a mistake somewhere down that line, and that's going to get you off and off and off.
And if you try to, if you try to approach God through logic, it's almost as if you set logic up as a greater God, I feel like, because you're trying to fit God within that logical,
logic.
framework, and you can't, right? So,
Mhm.
and that was something that was
right.
very, helpful that a priest told me once. So I was trying to understand the Trinity and how they all relate to each other, and he said that, again, some saint that I can't remember said, if you think about this too much, you'll go insane. And it was like, oh, okay, well, that's good.
Right. I think a lot of the saints say, this is what's been revealed to us.
Yes.
So again, experiential theologians, this is what's been revealed to us. So this is what we believe, and then we leave it at that.
Yeah.
But I don't know if it's the whole world that does this, but I know in the West, we're very rationalistic, and we always want to put everything in that rational framework.
Mm-hmm.
And the saints that have these experiences said, you can't do that. You just have to, this is what's been revealed. If God wanted us to know more, he'd reveal more. Maybe someday he will, but this is what we got.
And, it's funny you mentioned that, because it brings to mind, again, this is largely from perhaps a Lord of Spirits podcast, so I can cite my source here. But they recently, had a few episodes about modernism and postmodernism, and we were just by our fireplace with a friend of ours discussing these finer points of philosophy, and they had mentioned, some people will approach orthodoxy through a very modernist lens. They'll kind of logic their way into the church. They'll use that kind of scientific approach to say, well, orthodoxy makes the most sense if you look at church history and apostolic succession, yada yada yada, and that will get them close. And some people will take a postmodern approach and say, well, this is my subjective experience. This is how I feel when I come to a church. This is what I feel when I hear the music and the smell, the incense and the beauty of the liturgical practices. This is kind of my subjective, my truth. I can't project it on anyone else. And that will get them close to the church. But really, those are the two arms that kind of guide people to the center, which is Christ, right? And it's that intimate knowledge of Christ. And it's not an individual knowledge. It's not individualistic. It's a corporate knowledge of Christ, right? Like we draw closer to God as the body of Christ. And I think that's kind of, that transcends both of those ideologies. And as you say, the experiential theologians, I think, really have that experience of Christ,
Yeah, to clarify that, these are people that have gone through the purification, 3 stages, right? Purification, illumination, theosis. So they go through years and years of purification, and then God illumines them. Then they have this experience of God, and so that's kind of what we're talking about. It's not something you just come into Orthodoxy and 3 days later you're having some great experience, and now you're an experiential theologian. You have to go through years and years and years of purification process. And so anyhow, just to clarify that a little bit, so nobody misunderstood that you can just come in and 3 days later you can be experiential theologian. That doesn't work that way.
But it is it is a good place to be. If people are watching this and thinking about Orthodoxy or trying to understand Orthodoxy, or are off put by standing for long periods of time, which you don't have to stand, you can sit down. I was in church just the other week, and I was thinking, I've been standing for a while, but then I thought, where else would I want to be? Like we are in the presence of Christ. We are together worshiping corporately. I mean, we are the body of Christ. This is the best thing that we could do with our time, right? I mean, this is why we were created, and it's that very interesting feeling of just, I am in the right place. This is where I want to be. And that's just been a profound feeling for me. So.
Yeah. I'd also
and the reason why, go ahead.
Just like a couple of things, since this is, about our like conversion stories and stuff like that. We mentioned Lord of Spirits, and yes, Lord of Spirits is very important, and I feel like people hear that a lot, particularly in the like coming to Orthodoxy circles. You gave me the book Facing East by Federica Matthews Green. That was it was again another good book. It was one of those ones that like had me wrestling with things, but was ultimately like a positive experience. I also read Arise, O God by, I think, Father Andrew Stephen Damick. I think he's the one that wrote that. He's one of the podcasters on Lord of Spirits, that basically talks about what the Gospels are, and what a gospel is. And I thought that was very convicting. And then you watched a podcast, Be the Bee.
Yeah, there's a series that is online. I think I think it was through the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese, but it's the fellow that actually does the intro for Lord of Spirits. I didn't put that together
Oh, really?
for a year. But it's Be the Bee, and it's this concept that, there was a saint that talks about, and maybe Gary, you know this saint, but he says that we should be like the bees because they seek out that which is beautiful in the world, unlike the flies, which are attracted to filth. The bees, they diligently do their work, and they work very hard, and they seek out, beauty in the world. And it's just a very simple like series of 5-10 minute kind of mini YouTube videos, and it just talks about different concept of the Orthodox Church, and it was just, yeah, it was a very very nice series. I think it was like 100-200 videos or something in it, and it's a very nice.
So
Yeah.
those are also part of the journeys if people are interested in things to read or watch.
All right, one last thing to clarify, maybe before we go, about the standing. And the reason we stand, at least that's what I was told, because you stand in the presence of the king. And you don't sit in the presence of the king. You stand. So if you can stand, but if you can't stand, we have people who can't stand for long periods of time. So we're not like going to kick you out of church if you can't stand, but that's why we stand. So
Yes,
just to clarify
yes.
that.
Yeah, and it's interesting to understand the cultural context too. I mean, it's yeah, exactly. And the way it was explained to me is that in ancient times, yeah, the person of honor is seated, right? That's why we have thrones. And so standing is interesting connection to the ancient church and to ancient religion, to say, oh wow, I'm in the presence of somebody very important. And I think that's an interesting thing too, is this is perhaps a pitfall of pride that Sophia and I fall into, but there is this sense coming from Protestantism to say, well, my ancestors were Protestant. I'm going against my ancestors. And it is funny, I mean, we should encounter God regardless of what our family history is. But all people encounter the creator of all in some way. And it is interesting that, we identify so much with church history of the last few hundred years. I think I was kind of stumbling over and getting hung up on a lot of Protestant doctrines that are really a reaction to medieval Roman Catholicism. And they were less independent theological doctrines as much as they were kind of just retorts to Catholicism. And I remember, like sola scriptura and all these things. I remember thinking like, well, but it has to satisfy this rule. And then I thought, well, where'd that rule come from, right? I mean, the first person to say that was, a few hundred years ago. We're talking about there's church history beyond that, and I think there was somebody once said, to be a scholar of the history of the church is to be, I think they said is to be Catholic, but once you get further enough into church history, you start to realize that, the apostolic churches make a lot more sense with their history and their connection to the faith of the apostles.
Yeah. And to the point of standing, right? Like Orthodoxy has this wonderful thing where, yes, we stand because we're standing before the king, right? It is very physical in your relationship with God as well, right? It's less, I feel like I know coming from Presbyterianism, right? Like I would close my eyes and pray, and I still do, right? But you'd have to imagine and visualize, and you like everything about God and your beliefs were kind of up in your head more so than on the ground. And you're standing in church because you're standing before Christ the King, right? Because Christ was a king, Christ was real, and you have that image in front of you. And so it's just a much more kind of physical and present experience as well. So.
All right, well, my earpods are telling me that I need to recharge, so.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, we can go on for about 2,000 years about this.
Yeah, I should have charged them up.
No, you're good.
No, this is a good stopping time.
Right. Well, thanks for coming on. We appreciate
Yeah.
your stories. They're great stories and great conversion stories. And we hope that everybody will listen to these and get a sense of all the different ways people have come into the church and people have struggled and all the experiences that they've had. So, Matt, I'll give it over to you.
I just have to say thank you so much for spending your time with us and sharing all of that. It's really wonderful. And it's also really nice, Sophia. It's so nice to hear. So many of these stories are like, I came into the church and it was the most wonderful thing ever. It's really nice to hear someone who like, had a bit of struggle on the way in, and because there's lots of folks that have done that as well. So thank you so
Yeah.
much for sharing that so honestly. So blessings to you both, and your baby. Uh, so that's all I have to say. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Yeah, we really appreciate being able to chat with you all, and yeah, thank you so much, and pray for us.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's great to have you guys on.
Awesome.
All right. Well, have a great night. I'll hit the end, and then I'll hit the stop recording, and it'll stop. So thank you so much.
Perfect. All right.